The last stronghold, Siurana, and the spirit of the Moorish queen. There are places in this world that history has soaked into the stone itself. Places where the past doesn't feel like something you read about, it feels like something you can almost touch. Castel de Siurana is one of those places. Perched on limestone cliffs in the province of Tarragona, Spain, this 9th-century Moorish fortress holds the distinction of being the last Muslim stronghold in Catalonia to fall to Christian forces. That happened in 1153, nearly 450 years after the Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula began. When you stand among the ruins and look out over the landscape, that number stops being an abstraction. You feel the weight of it. The fortress was once considered impregnable, a hisn, a defensive tower built to hold against anything. It was largely dismantled in the 17th century, and during the Spanish Civil War it served as a refuge for anti-Franco guerrillas, the Maquis, who used its altitude and isolation the same way soldiers had for centuries before them. The surrounding countryside still yields hundreds of unexploded artifacts from the Battle of the Ebro. The land here has never truly been at peace, but the story that defines Siurana, the one that lingers long after you've left, belongs to a queen. Her name, Abdelazia, means servant of the mighty, or, depending on the translation, servant of the powerful, or servant of the beloved. I looked it up, the way most of us do when a name catches our attention, because names mean something, they always have. In 1153, when the forces of Ramon Berenguer IV finally breached the walls of Siurana after years of siege, the Moorish queen Abdelazia faced a choice. She could surrender to the conquering Christians and accept whatever fate awaited her, or she could choose her own ending. She chose her own ending. According to legend, she rode her horse to the edge of the limestone cliff and leaped into the abyss below. The moment has been remembered ever since as the Salt de la Reina Mora, the leap of the Moorish queen. As she jumped, her horse supposedly left a permanent hoofprint pressed into the rock at the cliff's edge, a mark that tourists still search for today. Some nights, locals say, she rides again, you hear hooves on stone, and then silence. I don't know what to make of legends like this. I went to Siurana looking for historical ghosts, and I found something, though I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. What I can tell you is that her story stayed with me, not because of the supernatural element, but because of what the leap represents. A woman at the end of everything, refusing to let someone else write the final line. There's something almost defiant about that. Something that feels less like tragedy and more like a last act of will. The Spanish countryside is filled with darker versions of this kind of story. In my research, I came across legend after legend of women who were not given that choice. Daughters locked in towers for loving the wrong man. Wives walled alive into Castle Stone because a husband's friend told a lie and the husband believed it without question. History in the Middle Ages was not kind to women who lacked power, and it was especially unkind to those who stood on the losing side of a religious war. Abdelazia stood on the losing side. She lost everything, and still she chose. That, more than any ghost story, is what haunts Siurana. To understand why Siurana mattered, you have to understand the conflict that made it a fortress in the first place. In 711 AD, the Iberian Peninsula was already coming apart at the seams. The Visigothic kingdom, which had controlled most of modern-day Spain and Portugal, was tearing itself apart in a civil war between supporters of the recently deceased King Witiza and the newly crowned King Roderick. Into that fracture came Moorish forces under the general Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossing from North Africa and defeating Roderick in battle. The kingdom didn't fall so much as collapse. Local communities, already divided and exhausted, were negotiating surrenders rather than mounting resistance. Within a few years, the Moors controlled most of the peninsula. The Christian pushback began quietly, in the mountains of the north. Around 718-722, a leader named Pelayo in Spanish, gathered a small force in Asturias and defeated a Muslim contingent at the Battle of Covadonga. It was a modest victory by any military measure, but symbolically it was enormous. It established a precedent. The Christian kingdoms of the north could survive, could resist, could fight back. What followed was nearly 800 years of intermittent warfare, shifting borders and slow territorial reclamation, a conflict known as the Reconquista. It wasn't always primarily religious in motivation. In the early centuries it was often more about political and territorial power than faith. But by the 11th century, the religious dimension had become dominant, and the wars carried the full weight of that ideology on both sides. The Reconquista didn't end until 1492, when Granada, the last Moorish kingdom on the peninsula, finally fell. Nearly 8 centuries of conflict, beginning with a small band of survivors in the mountains of Asturias and ending with the complete transformation of an entire civilization. Siurana was one of the last chapters of that story in Catalonia. In 985 AD, a Cordoban general named Almanzor, military strongman of the Caliphate of Córdoba, descended on Barcelona with devastating force. Between July 1st and July 6th, he besieged the city by land and sea, broke its defenses with catapults, left the garrison dead, and enslaved thousands of its inhabitants. Count Borrell II, the ruler of Barcelona, barely escaped by sea. Almanzor didn't occupy Barcelona. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to cripple it, to remind the Christian counties of the east that they were vulnerable, that their walls meant nothing, that no distance from the caliphate was truly safe. Almanzor, it worked, in the short term. But the long-term consequences weren't what Almanzor intended. The sack forced Borrell II to reckon with two things simultaneously: Barcelona's military vulnerability, and its political dependence on the Frankish kingdom to the north, which had failed to send aid in time. His response to both problems would shape the next 2 centuries of Catalan history. On the political front, he began severing ties with the Frankish crown, effectively setting the county of Barcelona on the road to full independence. On the military front, he turned his attention to defense. The coastline and the river valleys needed eyes. They needed warning. What followed was a surge in fortification across the region. While large, organized networks of stone towers would come later, the aftermath of the 985 sack saw a significant push to build torres almaneras, watchtowers, on strategic hilltops, particularly near the River Ter. Many of these early structures were modest, wooden constructions rather than the imposing stone towers we picture today. But their purpose was clear and urgent: to see the enemy coming before the enemy arrived at your gates. Think about what that meant in practical terms. A rider spots movement on the horizon, dust rising, formations shifting. He lights a signal fire. The next tower sees it and lights their own. Within minutes, a warning has traveled faster than any horse could carry it, leaping from hilltop to hilltop across the landscape. Towns could begin moving their people. Garrisons could prepare. The watchtower network was, in its own way, an early warning system, a chain of human alertness stretched across the countryside. These towers were humble compared to the great fortresses of the era, but they represented something important: a people learning from their wounds. The sack of 985 had caught Barcelona unprepared. Borrell II was determined that it would not happen again. In building those watchtowers, he was doing what leaders do after a catastrophe, trying to make sure the next attack could be seen coming. It is one of the quiet ironies of history that Siurana itself, the great impregnable fortress, would eventually fall not to a sudden raid but to the slow, grinding patience of a siege. No watchtower could have saved it from Ramon Berenguer IV. By then, the world had changed too much. Borrell II was the great-great-great-grandfather of Ramon Berenguer IV, and the independent, fortified Catalonia he began building was the foundation on which his descendant would construct something far larger. Ramon Berenguer IV, known as the Saint, became Count of Barcelona in 1131 and proceeded to reshape the political map of medieval Spain. In 1137, he was betrothed to Petronila, the infant heir to the Kingdom of Aragon, a political arrangement that united the county of Barcelona and the Kingdom of Aragon into a single realm, the Crown of Aragon. He governed Aragon as its prince, but deliberately never took the title of king, and that is when Andalusia rode to the edge of the cliff. I want to try to describe what it's actually like to stand in Siurana, because the photographs don't do it, and the history doesn't quite do it either. I'm afraid of heights. That's worth knowing, because it colored everything about how I experienced those cliffs. I couldn't get too close to the edge. I couldn't look down without my body sending urgent signals to my brain that this was a bad idea. And yet, despite all of that, despite the fact that my fear was very much present and very much real, I didn't want to leave. Something about that place was pulling at me. I don't have a better word for it than that. It wasn't the ruins themselves, though they are striking. It wasn't history, though I had spent weeks immersed in it before going. It was something in the atmosphere, something in the air and the stone and the light, that made me feel, strangely and inexplicably, like I had been there before. A quietness that had nothing to do with silence. There's an undertone to Siurana that I didn't expect. For a place with so much blood in its history, the long siege, the Queen's Leap, the Civil War guerrillas, the Battle of the Ebro, it doesn't feel dark. It feels, if anything, like a place that has been through everything and is still standing. I'm Irish American, and there's a certain kind of stubborn resilience I was raised to recognize, the spirit of people who fought for their right to exist, who refused to go quietly. I felt that in the land at Siurana. Or maybe I felt Abdelazia. Maybe that particular flavor of defiance has been embedded in the stone since 1153, left behind by a woman who refused to let someone else decide how her story ended. I wanted to be an archaeologist once, blame Indiana Jones. Life took me in other directions, the way it tends to do. So instead of digging up the past, I travel to it. I researched it. I sit with the uncomfortable parts of it and try to understand what it was actually like to be a human being living through events that we now reduce to a paragraph in a textbook. History is full of people doing terrible things. The Romans burned Christians alive. Christian rulers walled women into the stones of their own castles. Every era, without exception, has found ways to justify cruelty in the name of belief or power or fear. I don't write about this because I agree with any of it. I write about it because it happened, and because the people it happened to deserve to be more than a footnote. Abdelazia deserves to be more than a footnote. She was the ruler of the last Moorish stronghold in Catalonia. She held out longer than anyone else. And when there was nothing left to hold, she chose the cliff. Whether her spirit still rides along those edges on certain nights, I can't say. But something of her is still there, in the stone, in the legend, in the feeling that washes over you when you stand at the edge of that landscape and look out at everything she once defended. Go to Siurana if you ever get the chance. Go for the history, go for the legend, go for the view. But go ready to feel something you didn't expect, because that place has a way of reaching into you and finding something you didn't know was missing. I was left breathless. I haven't quite caught my breath since.